Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters.
Welcome, Reuben Poupko. Hope you're doing well despite the difficult circumstances we all go through currently.
Yeah, no, things are well. Things are getting better. That's the most important thing. Getting back to normal a little bit. Baby steps.
Wonderful, at least. Thank you so much for being on our show today. I'm very excited, and I'm sure our viewers are also excited to learn about Judaism. And to start with, what is Judaism, Rabbi Poupko?
You know, it's the Jewish people have been around for a long time. Our story goes back about 3,700 years, and it's the Bible story. It's the story of the Bible. It's the story of the Jewish people, and it's the revolution of monotheism is really what it is. We stand here in 2021, many centuries removed from the origins of Judaism, but some of the revolutionary messages of Judaism are as revolutionary today as they were when they were first articulated. And what I think people often miss out on or ignore is that monotheism is not simply a revolution about how you think about God. More importantly, it's a revolution about how you look at other people. Because monotheism is not simply an abstract theological idea. Monotheism is an idea which compels one, or should compel one, to view human beings differently. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Judaism grew up as a culture, as a civilization in opposition to paganism. That means if you ask somebody in Quebec or Switzerland today, you say, who are the Jews? Some of the people might simply say, oh, those are the people who aren't Christians. Those are the people who aren't Muslim. In other words, which is certainly understandable. Every identity comes with descriptives that are positive and those that are negative. When I say negative, I don't mean in an insulting way. I mean who you aren't, not just who you are, but who you aren't. So the question is not just who are Jews, but who aren't Jews. And the answer to that question is not Christians, because Judaism grew up as a civilization, long before Jesus walked this earth. And Judaism grew up as a culture in opposition, in contrast to paganism. So the answer to the question is who we aren't, is we aren't the pagans. And that's an important thing, because in the world of the pagan, there was a very different understanding of creation, of what a god meant. There were multiple gods. Gods had a physical form. Whether they worshiped the tree or the sun, it was something they could see. And Judaism comes and says, no, there's only one God. The God of Mesopotamia, the God of Egypt, it's one God. There's only one God. And when we say there's one God, that means there's one human race. Because in the world of the pagan, you and I may have nothing that is shared, nothing in common. Your God is not my God. Your origin story is different than my origin story. Judaism creates a revolution where not only do we begin to teach the world the belief in one God, but more important, we teach the world that we're all part of the same family of mankind, that we all come from the same place, that we have the same origin story, that we share something, that we share a destiny, we share so much, we share our common humanity. And the very words common humanity, that idea, which is almost universal today, only exists because of the revolution of monotheism, only because of the enormous success that Judaism and then Christianity and then Islam had in spreading this very basic moral idea. And I don't think people understand and appreciate the ethical consequences of monotheism. And that is what is so valuable. My late father, who was a rabbi, always refused to use the term monotheism. He always called it ethical monotheism, because monotheism is not simply an idea about God. It's an idea about our common humanity. And so I would argue today, for instance, that the atheist of 2021 who assumes common humanity as a moral imperative only does so because he's part of a culture and a civilization built on a monotheistic foundation. Absent monotheism, the very concept of a common humanity wouldn't exist. It means when you look on the internet and you see a picture of someone suffering in a place you've never visited, who speak a language you've never heard, practice a religion you don't understand, of a skin color that is different than your own, but you understand them and you feel their pain and you're motivated to care, that only exists because we're children of a common monotheistic culture, which taught us there's one God and therefore one human race. So that is one very essential message of Judaism. The other essential message, I would say, and this may explain a lot of things in history, it may not, I mean, people could disagree, but I believe that monotheism, whether in its Jewish form or Christian form or Islamic form, can be provocative. And what I mean by provocative is that it's disruptive to the way some people want to live. And let me explain what I mean. In the world of the pagan, where you worshiped what you could touch and see, that's a statement not just about what you're worshiping, it's a statement about yourself. If the God you worship is a God that's physical, what you're really saying is there's nothing about you that isn't simply physical. Monotheism challenges us to understand that there's more to us than just the physical. And the very ability that we have to imagine an unseen spiritual God, possibly, I believe, probably, but possibly implies there's something about us which is spiritual as well. Otherwise, we couldn't imagine a God without physicality, a God that's not material. It's elevating and challenging. Monotheism is provocative because it challenges all of us to say there's something more to us. We're not just put on this world, to satisfy ourselves, to acquire possessions or power. We're here for a higher purpose. There's something about us which is beyond the realm of the physical. That's the implication of monotheism, or should be the implication of monotheism. And I would say that some people find that provocative, because what monotheism is saying, really, the implicit message of monotheism is there's more to you. More is expected of you. You're not just here for yourself, you're here for others. You're not just here, to acquire, you're also here to give. It's a provocative idea. And that provocation, in fact, has played itself out in history. A lot of people do not want to hear much is expected of them. So that's what I would answer to the question is what is the foundation? What are the foundational ideas of Judaism?
Become a rabbi, a religious person. Okay.
Well, first of all, I'll give you the easy answer. Then I'll give you a deeper answer maybe. Listen, you can see, I don't know, everyone can see, but there are pictures behind me. Those are the pictures of my two late grandfathers who were both rabbis. One was a rabbi in what is now Russia, and one is a rabbi in the Ukraine. My father was a rabbi. His pictures on the other wall, you'll forgive me. And my father had 5 brothers, all of whom were rabbis as well. My father had 2 sisters, both of whom were married to rabbis. My 2 brothers are rabbis. My 2 sisters are married to rabbis. My mother had 3 brothers, all of whom were rabbis, and my 2 sons are rabbis. So you could say I didn't have a choice. But that's far from the truth. My father always encouraged myself and my brothers to do anything but we didn't listen to him. I'm a rabbi because I was inspired really by the model of my father, who may have never said these words, but lived and breathed them every day, which is there's no greater privilege than serving the Jewish people. And that's what I wanted to do always. And there's no greater joy in it than that. And And that's important. And that was always the most important thing to me.
There must be something, in your profession, in other words, rather to say calling, that must be deeply spiritual and religious, obviously, but there must also be something spiritual. Can you elaborate a little bit on the spiritual part of your profession?
It's hard to do. It's interesting. Judaism also tries to teach something. We're not very successful teaching this, but we try to teach something and it's certainly very countercultural. In the temple in Jerusalem, there were different areas of the temple. There was the more public area called the Azara, the courtyard. And then there was the holy area where you walked into a building, and there was the candelabra, there was a small altar, and on the right there was the table with the showbread, and then there was a curtain, which separated the place that was called holy from the place that was called the Holy of Holies. Kodesh Kadashim in Hebrew, the Holy of Holies, entered only once a year on the holiest day, the Day of Atonement, called Yom Kippur in Hebrew, where the Kohen Gadol, translated to the high priest, would enter that place only once a year. And in that room, there was the ark which held the 10 commandments. And he only entered it once a year. The lesson, I've always drawn from that is that the things that are most holy are also the things that are most private. So it's hard. The things that are most special to us are the things that are that we keep most private, personal. So so it's hard to talk about it. But listen, I've always seen myself as playing a role in the transmission of what I think are important ideas. Trying to teach those important ideas, of trying to help, the Jewish people appreciate more who they are and where they come from and where they may be going, and to also to play a role in the rightful role that any religious person should take in trying to do good for all, not just for your own community, and in trying to build, some kind of more harmonious society by reaching out to other religious groups on issues that we share in a common agenda. And all of these are very valuable to me, but on a deeply spiritual level, I fundamentally believe that this is the right way for me to live, and the right way that I respond to what I believe is the call of history or the call of God.
How did your profession as a religious person change over time, given that societies become more and more secular?
That's a tough one. I tell you, listen, there's not just one story about our culture. But you're right. The dominant story of our culture is that it is increasingly secular. What I mean by that is the culture certainly does not praise religion. Listen, there are a lot of reasons for that. Rabbinic and all religious figures have been bemoaning this for about 200 years now. But it's certainly the non-religious, the anti-religious tendencies are very strong and very powerful today in our culture. Religion is mocked in some circles, underappreciated in many circles. During COVID, we saw this with the disregard in many places for the openings of churches and synagogues. And that's clear that religion, I live in probably the most secular place in North America. Quebec is passionately secular. They went from one extreme to the other. One day every church in Quebec was full, the next day they were empty. I mean, that's very simplistic, but you understand what I mean. It went through a massive change, and there are lessons to be learned from that, and there are lessons that people aren't learning from that. And I know this from my Catholic colleagues, not from my own experiences, where they now appreciate the overreach prior to the Quiet Revolution, and that when religious authorities enjoy political or temporal power, that's not always a good thing. That the separation between church and state, you'll forgive me, I'm an American, so I use American idiom on this, the separation of church and state is good for the church. It leaves us untainted by the cynicism that most people have towards government and bureaucracy, and that's good for us. It is so extreme here in Quebec that in the rest of North America, when you talk about separation of church and state, one is thinking about, oh, let's protect the church from governmental interference. In Quebec, when you say separation, what people think is protect the government from church influence. It's a very different way of thinking, which explains a lot of things about Quebec, whether Bill 21 or whatever, where there's this lingering concern from the past about government having, where church has too much influence over the public sphere. So yes, we live in a culture that is certainly antagonistic at many times towards religion. The values are not our values, the things we value. I mean, I was trying to explain this to somebody the other day. We talk a lot about how Jews lived in, a lot of crazy places and everywhere in the world and a lot of nice places. And, there was often times where Jews weren't, I don't know if you know this, Yannick, but not everybody likes Jews. I don't know if you ever heard this. There are people. I don't know if you ever met it. I don't know. Anyways, there are people who don't like Jews. We still haven't figured out why. Anyway, so, but wherever we lived, going back 100 years, 200 years, we kind of forgot with the passage of time how much we had in common with them, as opposed to today, where many of our neighbors lead lives that are radically different than our own, right? And if you lived in a city in Poland, your neighbor down the block who was Catholic valued his church the way you valued your synagogue. He valued normative family life and community life the way you did. So there were, whether it was in dress or in respect, for religion, all of that was shared. And today, whether you're a religious Catholic or a religious Jew, you live in stark contrast to the dominant culture. You live are surrounded by people who don't value what we take for granted should be valued, and that is certainly a challenge.
Now there is also a phenomenon that it's called availability heuristic. In other words, we always kind of think that something is around that we just basically just experience right now, and now the very prevalent doctrine is really secularization, all those things. Do you really think it is as bad, or it is more that certain voices just got so much stronger? Because sometimes when you talk with people, most people really, they share these values, unless you live obviously in a social bubble. But I feel like I have a very diverse entourage, and I feel like it is not as bad as we might think sometimes. How do you respond?
I agree with you. I think that this is why you have to be careful when you talk about these things. In other words, the dominant voices in our culture are as I describe them, I believe. I believe when you scratch the surface and dig a little deeper, there is an abiding respect, or at the very least acknowledgement, that the values that are religious values, traditional values, are more vital than, again, the culture assumes, and that people do want faith in their lives. People do respect. Listen, I mean, the truth is between, let's be simple, keep it simple. You walk into a university classroom today, right? And you're in a classroom of kids who are majoring in history or political science. And you ask them a question. What's the major source of war in our world today? What's the major number one source of conflict in our world? At least half, probably much more, will say religion. And that's tragic. Okay. Whether it is some of the, and I don't like to, I don't mean to criticize, but just to talk about the obvious, some of the events that have dominated the conversations about the Catholic Church the last 20 years, right? The Islamic extremists and the violence perpetrated in, in the Middle East and in Europe and even in North America, 9/11 and everything else. Certainly, all of that taints religion in general. All of it does, and so that's a serious problem. But I do believe that there is a longing for spirituality, a longing for the meaning and purpose and direction of religious life. And I also believe, besides all of the benefits, and I always dislike a conversation that only talks about the benefits of religious life. I want to talk about the authenticity of religious life. Okay, the authenticity of the religious pursuit. And people know what's real. People on a gut level know what's real. And the pursuit of something authentic. And that has, has carried us through for so many centuries and for so long. The authenticity of it is important. And yes, 20% of North America is on Twitter, and 1% of Twitter users dominate the conversation. And if you say something that deviates from the new orthodoxy, that is so powerful they are more fanatical than any religious fanatic I ever met, in terms of excommunication and denunciation and penance and words you're allowed to say, words you can't say. It's as if the Inquisition has been resurrected on the smartphone, and that's what's happened. Is that and because of that, there's a fear out there. There's a fear of being canceled or marginalized because of something you say or do. There's a fear. I mean, I'm still old enough to remember that when liberalism became very active in the 60s, it was part of the free speech movement. I'm old enough to remember that, the equal rights movement in the 60s was about judging every human being as an individual, ignoring the color of one's skin, focusing on the quality of their character, as Martin Luther King inspired millions, tens of millions, to understand and believe and to live. And now what are we told? No, you have to judge someone by the color of their skin. You judge them only by the color of their skin. The only acceptable prism through which to see all of society is the color of your skin. And that is horrific change, where you have, where universities are now creating dormitories for different races based on common background and ethnic origin. I mean, this is something Martin Luther King would have been astounded to contemplate, where segregation is now considered the liberal way. We have separate graduation ceremonies in high schools in America based on ethnicity, where it's assumed that if you're white, you have enjoyed a certain kind of privilege that condemns you to be assumed to be at least implicitly racist, at the very least, if not worse, and that if you're of a different skin color, it is assumed that you enjoy the virtuous status of a victim. I mean, I'm off on a tangent, but it's your fault, so I'll keep going. I remember before COVID, the issue that dominated the Jewish agenda before COVID was the extraordinary uptick in anti-Semitic assaults, particularly in places like New York and Los Angeles. Right, we had the shootings in the synagogue in Pittsburgh. We had the terrible shooting in New Jersey, and in Muncie, New York, a stabbing attack, violent attack on Jews. And and every other day it seemed, whether it was Williamsburg or Borough Park, another ultra-Orthodox Jew was being beaten up on the streets. Okay. And I was at a rally in New York against this. 500,000 people showed up, all kinds of people, black, white, everybody showed up to denounce the anti-Semitism. This was in January of 2020, right before COVID. And it was a wonderful expression of, New Yorkers against the hate. And it was called "No Hate, No Fear" was the slogan of the rally. And then Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, said, "Oh, this is all about white supremacists, which have been triggered by Donald Trump." And then the New York Times, which is not known to support Donald Trump, the New York Times interviewed the captain of the hate squad department of the New York City Police Department, asking him about what Bill de Blasio said. It's white supremacists. And he said, not a single hate crime perpetrated against the Jews in New York City. I'm not talking about what happened in Pittsburgh. In New York City is attributed to white supremacists. That overwhelmingly, not 60%, not 70%, not 80%, but overwhelmingly, the attacks on Jews on the streets of New York were committed by African Americans. And you're not permitted to say that because, again, the assumption is if you are of a skin color, that makes you a virtuous victim who is unimpeachable. Unless, of course, you commit the crime of being a black Republican in America, which is another story. Right? Same thing with the Asian hate crimes, the terrible Asian hate crimes that were going on. And again, people start screaming white supremacists. Overwhelmingly, those were committed by African Americans or Hispanics, those crimes. Now, we can all try to figure out why that is. Part of it has to do with the mental health crisis and the deinstitutionalization. There's a lot of complicated factors here. But here's the point. If you preach that results that you don't think are equitable must be the result of racism, then who do you target? If you're part of those who feel that their result is less than equitable, you target those who you feel have benefited unfairly, as if the Asian immigrants did anything unfair to achieve the success that they have, or immigrant Jews did anything nefarious to achieve the success that they have. So, but again, if you preach over and over again that a result which isn't exactly equal must be the result of racism, then towards who is your animus directed? It's a recipe for disaster. And that's not liberalism. That's the opposite of liberalism. And so I know I'm off on a tangent. This conversation has nothing to do with religion, but when those are the dominant cultural trends, traditional religious life is now being replaced by a new religion. You know, a great Christian philosopher once said this, talking about the trends in his day 100 years ago. People think if they remove religion, it won't be replaced by something else. He said it'll be replaced by something, but something very dangerous. And here you have the critical race theory and all this stuff, which is a replacement for religion. It has public acts of penance. It has excommunication. It has words that are allowed and words that are prohibited. It has a theory which explains everything. It's not an economic theory or political theory. It's a theory through which everything can be understood according to its proponents. That you see everything through the prism of one aspect of the human dynamic of their race. And in that world where you have is that a world where traditional religious life can thrive? When you've replaced religion with a new orthodoxy? That's tough, but again, I agree with you. I believe that they have had the power to silence, but they haven't had the power to convince. I don't believe they've convinced as many people as we imagine. I believe you are right, that people generally speaking, what they used to call the silent majority, are still people who respect religion, who themselves are engaged in one form or another in traditional religious life, would certainly appreciate more of it. But the stigma, there's almost a stigma in some quarters to proclaim yourself a person of faith. And that is deeply troubling and destructive.
Rabbi Reuben Poupko, thank you so much for being on our show. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.